Howie Rose, who obviously does a tremendous job calling Mets games, joins us now. And Howie, you probably had a couple of Tom Seaver posters on your wall, I mean, as well as Tom did. And you know about Tom better, more so than most. Just some of your thoughts about Tom Seaver and what he meant to the Mets organization and what he meant to baseball.
Well, it'll probably take hours to explain it, and thanks for having me on, guys. But, the one thing that really stands out just within the last minute or so is that what Johnny Bench just said about Seaver in that 1970 All-Star game in Cincinnati reinforces what I've thought now for more than 50 years, and maybe some of it had to do with the low home camera that NBC used to televise that All-Star game. But those 3 innings that Seaver threw in that All-Star game were the hardest I ever saw him throw for a concentrated amount of time. I mean, he was just throwing darts for 3 innings that the greatest hitters the American League had to offer, and as usual, he dominated them. But what he meant to the Mets is almost impossible to articulate. You almost had to have been aware of what the Mets were in the early stages of their existence to get a real grasp on Seaver's impact almost from the moment he arrived in 1967. It's just a huge loss in so many ways, and one that, quite frankly, is a guy who idolized him as a kid and then was fortunate enough to call him a broadcast colleague and an occasional on-air partner and later on a friend as well. It's still a little hard for me to process, guys.
Yeah, watching those old videos, man, how about the delivery of Tom Seaver? I mean, I don't think I saw anyone just make pitching into such an art the way that Tom Seaver did. But, Howie, I want to ask you about the way that the Mets, and specifically Gil Hodges and Rube Walker, the pitching coach, when they inherited this young pitching staff, especially Seaver, Koosman, Gentry, and Ryan. In 1968, they go to a 5-man rotation. Back in the day, before anybody started counting pitches and knowing what workloads were, they were careful with these guys. Those 4 pitchers wound up throwing 15,000 innings in the major leagues. Tell me about the importance of Hodges and Walker to a young Tom Seaver. We knew he had the stuff, but informing who Tom Seaver was for so many years.
Well, they knew he was the horse, and there were some guys on that pitching staff who would eventually come to suffer from and even resent the fact that whenever there was an opportunity for one of them to be passed over because of a rain out or a glitch in the schedule where maybe you had a couple of off days in a week, they would keep Tom in rotation. And of course, why wouldn't you? You had to. He was arguably the best pitcher in the game almost the entirety of his Mets career. But I know that it, for occasions, would bother Nolan Ryan and Gary Gentry in particular because they had starts that were occasionally passed over in deference to Tom. But, hey, that's just the way it breaks when you've got a Hall of Famer. And, Gil inherited Tom after Seaver had 1 year in the big leagues. He was the Rookie of the Year in 1967. Wes Westrom was the manager. And Tom always talked about the way he connected with Rube in particular. I mean, we know his relationship with fellow Marine Gil Hodges was special. And, Tom would always tear up when he would talk in retrospect about the impact that Gil Hodges had on him. But Rube was equally important, I think, to the ascension of Tom to the role that he eventually took as the preeminent pitcher in baseball.
Does the stature grow, and not only Tom Seaver, but the old-time guys like Bob Gibson as well, who we lost? When you look at, Tom's numbers, over 300 wins, over 3,600 strikeouts, the 61 shutouts, which, in today's game, these are things that we're just never going to see again. And I get it, like wins aren't necessarily considered to be important. But when you look at those kind of numbers, I would think that Tom Seaver's stature will only continue to grow with time.
It did, and it will continue to, as you bring up, Fran. And that's why, I don't know if you guys touched on this at all or plan on it, but the day after, and I'm talking less than 24 hours after we learned of Tom's passing, right at the end of August, beginning of September of this year, the Mets had a makeup game at Citi Field against the Yankees, of all people. And we hadn't had time to process this. And I'll tell you, that was the loneliest I have ever felt at a Major League Baseball game, because Mets Nation or Mets Universe or whatever moniker you want to give it, they needed to be together that day to mourn because we knew that Tom was in ill health, but we didn't know that his passing was imminent. So we were all shocked when we showed up at the ballpark that day. And I think his impact in an odd way was made even greater to me by the fact that the Mets were able to come back and pull off a tremendous comeback against the Yankees. And yet it was so hollow because there was nobody at the ballpark to share it with. And for some reason, that's always going to stick out in my mind when I think back to memorable games that Tom Seaver and the Mets were involved in, the last of them coming posthumously.
And what about a memorable moment for you? If you go back to a Mets fantasy camp and you were sporting the number 41?
Yeah, that was kind of dumb because I'm left-handed and I probably throw about 30 miles an hour. And truth be told, my all-time favorite Met was Gil Hodges. And I thought that it would be disrespectful to wear 14. So I said, what the heck, put on 41. But don't show anybody any tape of that because that's going to set back the appetite for learning to pitch years and years and years. And as this is a morning show, it might even bring back some breakfasts.
That reminds me of a story when Tom was a broadcaster doing Yankees games. We had a media game in Seattle, just media writers against the Seattle media writers. Tom was watching the game. All of a sudden, he walks out of the stands. He gets tired of watching these writers flipping balls up there. He struck out the side wearing his leather loafers and pants and on 9 pitches as well. So how you know what a competitor he was in the booth or on the field.
Well, you could relate to this from being in the booth in real time, Tom, during games. One of the most fascinating recollections I have of working in the booth with Tom was we're in St. Louis. I'm going to say it was like 1999, 2000, somewhere in there. And I call a pitch, and then Tom starts talking, and he interrupts himself to say, oh, that's a balk. He called the balk, if you go 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Seaver probably called the balk about 1.5 seconds before the umpire did.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah, amazing. We could sit here and do this all day long and look back at the great career of Tom Seaver. Howie, we appreciate you spending some time with us. Continued success down the road. You're an icon and a legend in New York as well. But thank you for joining us to talk about Tom.
You're very kind. Have a great holiday season, and thanks for having me on.